Hi, this is Pyramid from Squarp, and it's a sequencer, which means it doesn't make any sounds, and you can play your own instruments, but if you have a sequencer, you can let it do it for you. Pyramid is one of the most feature-packed sequencers I've ever seen, and it can control quite a few instruments. And live loop as well. Now, I've already reviewed Pyramid in the past, so if you want to see that review, there's a link below. The purpose of this video is to take a deep dive and look at its features in detail. Let's start with a bird's eye view. This is a sequencer, so it doesn't make any sounds, but rather its goal is to be the brain or the central hub for controlling all your software and hardware instruments. In terms of connectivity, it can control dozens of instruments simultaneously, and the way that it talks to them is using the outputs on the back. There are two MIDI DIN outputs, and it can communicate via USB as well. So you can control software instruments on a computer or use a computer to route control to other hardware. There are also CV, gate, and mod outputs to control modular gear. And while we're talking about the back panel, there's also an SD card to store projects and to load in MIDI files. Pyramid also has inputs. There's a MIDI input for controlling, sequencing, and routing MIDI out. And these are stereo foot switch, CV, and gate inputs. On the panel, roughly speaking, this is the transport section. These pads are for playing live, sequencing, and activating tracks. There are 5 encoders and an XY pad that are assignable to any parameter you want across any of the sequencers, and they also have some functions in editing parameters. The LCD screen with its main data knob encoder, and general mode controls here on top. Now, before diving into how to use it, there are 3 terms you need to wrap your head around: tracks, patterns, and sequences. A track can contain one or more patterns that have notes and modulation information that can be sent out to your instruments. And a sequence tells tracks whether to play or not, whether they're muted or not, and if they contain multiple patterns, which of those patterns to play. So if you can imagine the progression of a song, you can have these 2 tracks playing a pattern, and then this track can come in, and this track can come in, and then the pattern could potentially change on this track, and this track can come in and play one pattern, and then it can move to play a different pattern. That progression from one to the next to the other is something you can do either manually or control through a series of sequences. Generally speaking, Pyramid has 4 modes. Red live mode, where you use the pads to play notes and automations in real time. The green step mode, which you use if you want to enter steps one at a time rather than playing them live. The yellow track mode, which lets you mute and unmute tracks, as well as control various track parameters, and the blue sequence mode, which lets you create and manage the overall song structure. You use this if you either want Pyramid to play on its own, or to change multiple patterns or mute or unmute multiple tracks at once. And there are other core features that I'll cover in depth, like MIDI FX, CC automation, the Euclidean sequencer, and polymetric and polyrhythmic capabilities. We've got a lot to cover. Let's talk about how far you can push Pyramid. You can store as many projects as you like on the SD card. In each project, you can have 64 different tracks stored in 4 banks of 16 tracks each. Each track can be realistically any length you like, up to 384 bars, I think. And per each of the 64 tracks, you have a choice of how you want to route its MIDI data out, whether it's to one of the 16 channels in outputs A and B, or through one of the 16 channels in the USB output or the CV outputs. A track can also transpose other tracks, more on that later, but just to finish covering the limitations, 64 tracks, you have 32 sequences, where per sequence, like I said before, you can change patterns or mute or unmute tracks. And each track can store 32 different patterns. And this is where it might, as they say, bake your noodle. Again, 64 tracks, 32 patterns for each of the tracks, and you can select one of those patterns to play per sequence, and there are 32 sequences. Furthermore, while you can step sequence in the traditional 16 steps per bar, the steps really aren't tied to any particular grid, and each step can contain as many notes and as many automations as you like. I'm sure there's a limit on storage in here somewhere, but you're going to have to try pretty hard to reach it. One more thing in terms of overall navigation, you change modes by pressing these buttons quickly. Occasionally, you'll find yourself needing to quickly reach one mode while you're in another. You can long press that mode, then perform whatever function you want, and then when you leave the button, you'll go back to the original mode. Let's talk about the screen a little bit. It has a lot of information, so it might make sense to break it down. Generally speaking, the top and left sections more or less stay the same, and the bottom and middle or right section will change based on the mode you're in. You've got the track name up here, and that will change as I move between the tracks. A track that's grayed out means that it's muted, so if I unmute this, you'll see it more clearly. Over here, you've got the current sequence, and then this will tell you which output that track is being sent to. Notice how this changes as I move between the tracks. When you're playing a sequence, the top bar here will show you if information is being sent out or being received via MIDI. And this indicator here next to the arrow means information is being sent out on USB. Generally speaking, the center right part of the screen will show you what this encoder changes. And then this bottom portion typically shows you the progress of your track or sequence, as the case may be. Each of the modes has an alternate display mode, which you get to by pressing this button, and that will show you different things as relevant per that particular mode. You set the tempo by either tapping the BPM button or holding it and moving the encoder. Sometimes you'll have access to additional functions by either pressing the encoder or using the second or shift key. So for example, to set the BPM, I can hold this and move the data knob, but if I press it in, you can see it moves by 0.1 increments. Or for example, when changing the project tempo while holding the second button, the actual tempo won't change until you release the shift or second button. Moving on with our general overview in terms of MIDI effects, which we'll cover in depth later on, Pyramid has up to 4 assignable MIDI effects in addition to the quantization effect. And the XY pad and these 5 encoders can be assignable either for global controls across the project or for controls on a per track basis. The stop and play controls on the transport section are pretty straightforward. The record button for live does exactly what it says, and it has different functions for step track and sequence modes. Finally, generally speaking, these white labels are accessible, as you can see, by holding the second button. So for example, if I wanted to see the settings, I would hold second and settings. And then these yellow and green labels are relevant only when you're in the green step mode or yellow track mode. Holding second and live turns on the metronome, and a metronome can be defined in the settings as a note sent on any track you like or on the current track. Okay, so now that we understand the basic layout, let's see how we can create a track and put notes and automation on it. Now, since Pyramid doesn't make any sounds on its own, the first thing we need to decide is what a track is going to control. Track settings are determined by these settings here and more on tracks later, but we won't be able to program a track until we tell it what to control, and we do that using the channel function. So for example here, you can see the track 9A is set to control USB channel 1. If I select a different track, let's say track 1, you can see that that is set to control MIDI A channel 1. The control options for tracks are CV outs, MIDI A all 16 channels, MIDI B all 16 channels, then USB 16 channels. Then there are a few options to choose combinations, MIDI A and B, USB and MIDI A, and so on. And then the last option is this thing here, which means that a track can be a master transpose track. That means in this case that this track will transpose any tracks that are set to follow the master transpose. Now we'll talk about more track features later on, but to access the master transpose follow configuration for a track, you hold the track, and then move over to transpose over here and select it. So I will select track 9, which is what I'm using to control the Prophet Rev 2 over here. In this case, I'm using USB 1. It's routed through a computer, but you can control it directly, obviously, if you like as well. Before we move on to actually entering notes, generally speaking, there are two ways to set a track's length. You can either do it using the length button and choose how many bars you want a track to be, or if you just want to jam live and determine in real time when a track will start looping on itself, you go to the settings, miscellaneous, and you turn on the live looping, which also has a quantization factor for when it starts looping. Okay, so we're ready to either play notes live or to step sequence them. Let's start by taking a look at playing live. Now, while in other modes, your master control are these 16 pads, whether it's steps, tracks, or sequences, in live mode, the layout is a little bit different. You should look at these two rows as like a chromatic piano layout. And then these pads on the bottom are smart pads with different functions, which we'll talk about. Since this obviously represents only one octave, you can transpose using these buttons, using these arrows. Finally, if you have a MIDI keyboard plugged in, you can play using it as well. I've got my metronome going, an appropriate cowbell. I can practice if I want, and then when I'm ready to record, simple as that. If I don't like what I recorded, I can hold second and delete, and it's gone. Now, these pads aren't velocity sensitive, so if I want to set the velocity at which I'll playing and still use them to record live, I can either go into step mode or temporarily hold it and then select velocity and change that here. You can see the number change right here. This will be the velocity going forward in live mode. And I can also record using an external keyboard. And then in this case, it will be recorded with velocity. So let's try that out. Note the timbre change, the harder I press. Right? So either option works. Now, currently I've got Pyramid set into Omni mode, so regardless of the track that I record, this will always be controlling the active track. But if I want, I can direct the keyboard to a particular track. While we're on the topic of playing live, if you hold a few notes and you want them to be held, you can press second and play, and they'll hold as drones, and you can change the synth parameters. A second press on second and play will move into relatch mode. And then pressing that again will exit relatch altogether. By default, recording adds notes to the tracks. So if I play something, it'll be recorded on top, the notes will be added. If you don't want that, just hit Shift or second and record. There will be a countdown. This is called hard record, and it overwrites whatever is on the track. So that's playing notes straight up using these pads or an external keyboard. Let's talk about this row, which is the smart pads. These have 4 functions which are selected by holding live and turning this encoder, what's called the data knob. The first smart pad mode is called chord mode, and if you hold display, you'll see which chord each pad plays, and there are lights here to indicate that as well, if the notes are in the octave you're looking at. And you can change the chord sets by rotating the data knob. And you can change the complexity of the chords by holding the data knob and turning it. You can add inversions, blues, so on. And you can also reduce the amount of notes per chord if you want. The second smart pad mode is repeat, which is pretty simple. Once you hold the note, and then any one of the pads will repeat it at different intervals. This can be applied to percussion as well, of course. Turning the data knob sets the gate for each note. The third out of 4 smart pad modes is scale mode. And yeah, who needs black keys when you have these? You use the data knob to select any number of scales, and you use the second button to transpose it. One note about this scale feature, it only impacts the smart pads. If you want to impact other notes in your pattern, you can do that using a MIDI effect. We'll talk about that later. Now, the fourth and final smart pad mode is custom. This lets you program any custom chord you want into any of the smart pads. You just play the notes you want to program, and then second and the pad, and then that chord is programmed here. If you hit display, you can see the notes played. You can also program chords using an external keyboard. Pyramid keeps the chord in memory, so take your time playing it, second and pad, and you've got it programmed. So this is a really nice way to program big custom chords. And you can program 32 of these. You see 8 at any given time, and you can move between custom chord bank A, B, C, or D. Okay, so we're wrapping up soon on live mode. Before we say goodbye, you've got the second function with copy, paste, delete, and even undo for data in that track. Let me clear up this track. That's basically live mode. Let's talk about step mode. Now, just like there are a few live modes, there are also a few step modes, which you access by holding step and turning the data knob. Let's start with the simplest one, which is note mode. The way this works is you decide the note you want to enter onto a particular step, and then you hit the step. There are 2 ways to set the velocity of a note. You either hold the velocity button and change the data knob, or you can use these assignable encoders, and there's a little icon which tells you what each one does. So for example, for velocity, I need to use this one. Right, so this is a much faster way to set velocity. Same for note width, I could do it like this, or like this. You can also offset notes using this or this, so that they're not stuck to a grid. These 2 functions, by the way, the E steps and E fills, are relevant only for Euclidean mode. We'll get to that in a bit. So I programmed one note. Let's say I want a G here, and then a high C here. And let's check out the pattern. Brilliant. And since I'm step sequencing, I don't need my metronome anymore. I can turn it off. Right? Simple pattern. Now you may have noticed that I entered C4 here, G4 here, and C5 here, but now C4 and G5 are gone. So they're not really gone. Right now I'm in a mode which lets me look at one note at a time. So these are all the C5s in my pattern because it's a polyphonic pattern. And then if I go here, these are all the G4s, and then these are all the C4s in the pattern. Now that's a pretty convenient mode for entering percussion, where this would say be the kick note, and then the next one would be the hi-hat. But if you want to see a view of all the notes at one time, there are 2 ways to do that. Number 1 is hit the record button, and now you can see representations of all 3 notes at once, and you can disable notes, all of them at once per step if you like. And then there's display mode, which lets me see an entire piano roll view of everything in my track. So I can go and program my C4 here, and my G4 here, and my C5 here, and I can see everything conveniently on a piano roll. If you have an external keyboard connected, it's really easy to enter notes or chords just by pressing them once and then hitting the pad you want the chord to appear on. Now these 2 modes where you see either one note at a time or all the notes at a time are called mono and poly mode. It's a little bit confusing. Poly editing is where you see one note at a time and you move across the piano like this, across the piano roll like this. And then in mono editing, you're seeing everything at once. So if I want to clear out my track, I can do that easily in mono mode. If I want to clear out individual notes, I do that in poly mode. Another benefit to using an external keyboard is that step mode remembers how hard you pressed a note, not just which note you pressed. So I can enter a little silent note here, and a harder one here, and then a middle one here, and that will be recorded in the pattern. Okay, so that's really nice for 16 steps, but what if you have more than 16 steps in your pattern? Well, the first thing we need to do is make the track longer, and we do that like this. And then you simply move between the pages using the arrow keys. So this is page 1, and this is page 2, and I can move back and forth like this. Now that works well for 16, 32, or 64 step patterns, but what if you have really long patterns, or you want to drill down into the fine details of a pattern? For that, you've got the zoom function, and because it's a yellow label, you know you need to access it by holding track, holding zoom, and then turning the encoder, and then you can zoom in or out and edit either in really fine detail or zoom out to see the entire pattern. Notice that when you zoom in and out, you're not just changing the view of the screen, but also what these pads represent. And it's a little bit hard to have you see that, how the pads change, and have my hands here, but hopefully you get the idea how each pad represents a different number of steps depending on the zoom level. Okay, to keep things simple, I'm going to shorten my track back to 1 bar and then zoom in. If you want to edit existing notes, you just hold that note and change its parameter. So I'm changing velocity here. But you can apply that to anything like length, or check out here, offset. You can't see it at this resolution. And of course, the note itself. There's a nifty feature where if you hold a note and press the encoder down, it will preview that note. You can also shift a note left and right using the arrow keys. Hold record, and then you can edit the entire occurrence of that note for that track. And if you're in mono mode, you can just transpose everything. Right? Everything you do here applies to all the steps. There's also a little performance trick where you can hold second and mute a note in a pattern and then bring it back in. An easy way to jump between the notes in poly mode rather than just looking for them like this is just hit the step button. You'll jump from active note to active note, and you can edit them that way. So that is note mode, which, as you may remember, is one of 5 different step modes, right? We've got note, chord, Euclidean sequencing, and then we'll talk about these two in a bit, right? Let's move on quickly to chord mode. And this one's pretty simple. You choose a chord using the data knob, and you transpose it by holding the second button. So let's say if I want yeah, why not? Let me erase these notes. And then when I hit a new pad, it will enter a chord. So in chord mode, I can transpose the chord like this. I can preview it by pressing down, change it by holding second, try a bunch of different chords, maybe this one. And when I've got the chord I want, just place it where I want in the sequence. So that's chord mode, which is the second mode in step mode. Let me erase this step and move on to Euclidean sequencing. Now, when the Euclidean sequencer is active, the other 4 step modes aren't. So you either choose this or the other 4. So the idea with Euclidean sequencing is pretty simple. You select either the note you want to play or the percussive instrument you want to play. And then you just choose how many steps you have in your Euclidean pattern and how many of them will be filled. And you can also use these 2 encoders for it. And that's a really nice way to create interesting rhythmic patterns. You can also play a chord like this. You won't hear it until I activate the pattern, but now, as you can hear, we're applying Euclidean sequencing to a chord. Now once you've set a pattern that you like, you can change the chord. So that's Euclidean step mode, and if you layer multiple Euclidean tracks with multiple different notes or percussive elements, you can create some really interesting rhythms. Okay, so that's Euclidean step mode. Let's move on to the two other step modes, which are CC modulation step mode and effects modulation step mode. I'll start with CC, that may be the easier one to understand, and then move on to effects. So CC parameters are like knobs on your synth. They change how it sounds or change its parameters, and you can modulate and control and step sequence every single one of the CC parameters of your synth using the pyramid. If you want to move quickly between the CC numbers, hold second, and I'm looking for CC number 102, perfect, which is the filter cutoff on my Rev 2. Once I've set my control change target, I need to set the actual value. I do that by setting the velocity and just picking a step. So if I've got a pattern here, I want to open and close the filter at various levels. This process is very similar to parameter locking on Electron devices. Right? And there's a more cool and fluid way to record automation, which is by holding the record button and moving your hand across the pad. You can also offset the entire automation by holding record and turning this encoder. Or edit steps by holding a step and using this encoder. Number 3. As per usual, you can use the zoom function to zoom in and out on your automation. So now that you understand CC automation, let's talk about the last step mode, which is effects automation. Now we haven't talked about the effects or the MIDI effects yet, but by default, every track has the quantizer effect built in to slot number 1. And we can automate or modulate even those parameters. So we can enable or disable quantization, we can select the grid, we can humanize the notes, and there's also a legato feature as well as one of the quantization parameters. If I go into MIDI effects and add another MIDI effect, and let's choose, for example, a harmonizer, and then say, add an octave here. Okay, we've got these two harmonizers going. Now each of these parameters becomes a destination in our effects automation. Let's look for these as a destination. What do you think? Let's do this one, for example. Pretty crazy, but that's how you automate effect parameters. One more thing I think that's worth mentioning about the effects step mode, where you modulate effects, is that even when you look at the display, as you scroll through the different parameters, let's say arpeggiate or style, notice how you can see the exact names of what the target is. So it's not just a modulation destination with a random number, but rather you can see exactly what you're going to assign to the track. Okay, a few more miscellaneous items about step mode. The first is this bottom part of the screen, the track player zone. You can see that as I increase the track length, bars are added, and black bars mean that that's the total length of the pattern, whereas the white bar represents the zoom level. So as I zoom in, you can see I'm looking at portions of one bar. As I zoom out, I'm looking at more active pages or active bars, which are represented on this grid here, and of course on screen when I move into note mode. So this is represented not just in terms of white bars out of black bars, but also when you page through the different pages, you can see how I move forward between this half of my pattern and this half. I'll move my track back to what it was, 2 bars, and zoom level to 1 bar. If I hit play on this pattern, you can see this little arrow here. It represents which of the 2 bars I'm looking at, and you can have this cursor track the current position by hitting second and display. Few more functions here. I'll add these steps. Notice it says rotate here. If I hit second and hold the right and left arrows, I can shift the steps left and right. And if you want to duplicate a track, you hold track and length, and then these arrows will duplicate or divide tracks. Copy and paste work here as well, whether to copy entire pages, copy and basically paste onto the next page, or you can also copy step ranges. So let's take these 3 steps, hit second, copy, pick a range, and then paste a destination, and the 3 steps are copied. And when you've made too much nonsense, shift delete deletes the page. So that more or less is step mode. Let's move on to track mode. Front and center, these pads are used for muting or unmuting patterns. The brightly lit pads are active. The dimly lit ones are muted, so I can just hit play. Got a little hi-hat here and an arpeggiated pattern here. Turn that off. Bring it back. Turn off the hi-hats. Very simple to mute and unmute tracks. We've already talked quite a bit about what these 3 buttons with the yellow labels do. This changes the channel, remember, USB, MIDI, and so on, as well as the transpose track, zooming in and out, and changing track length. Solo will let you solo a track. Right, so now we're hearing just this track, and you can unsolo it. And time signature lets you mess around with the time signature of the track. We'll talk about that when we get to polyrhythms and polymeters. And remember, we have 4 banks of 16 tracks. You move between the banks, bank A, B, C, and D, using these arrows. And you can see that empty banks are just plain numbers here, and muted banks are sort of grayed out. If I unmute it, it will become unmuted. And then the active track has those 2 lines on top. So if I move to, say, track 4, you see these 2 lines, 3, 2, 1. That's the track we're editing in live and step modes. The display mode shows you how your tracks are progressing in relation to each other. You can tell track 3 is twice as long as tracks 1 and 2. Now we touched on track settings before. Let's expand on that. Beside these 5 options, you also have second and track, which gives you access to these parameters. You can use the encoders to select program and bank on your synth, and the parameters on top do a few interesting things. The first is name your track. So this is an ARP, no reason not to call it that. Right, and it's easier to identify tracks this way. Call lets you call in or bring in hardware definition files. Now in my setup, I've got 909 MIDI on my computer, but a Digitact and a Rev 2. I'm using the Digitact track right now, so those are the settings that I'm using in this particular track. A definition file is basically a customizable hardware template, and what this gives me, if I go back to step mode and go into CC sequencing, you'll notice that now the parameters have names which correspond exactly to Rev 2 parameters. Remember, 102 is the filter cutoff. Now it's called filter cutoff. There are a bunch of definition files on the Squarp forums, or you can create your own. For example, I created this Digitact file, and I gave a name to every note that represents a sample on the Digitact. You can create your own definition files, and obviously it's up to you to match between the name and the sample that's loaded on your drum machine, but this is way more useful than using note names. Let's go back to track and track parameters. The consolidate function lets you take whatever active MIDI effects you have on the particular channel and consolidate them into actual notes on the track so that you can then free up your MIDI effects slots and do something else with them. Consolidate will also freeze Euclidean tracks into the new static track that is created once you press the consolidate button. Other options on the track with second and track are the run modes, which determine how tracks behave as you move from one sequence to the other, whether they continue running, whether they run just once and then stop, or whether they reset back to their initial step and start immediately as a sequence changes. The transpose function will cause this track to follow transpose tracks. Remember, when we determine what a track does, what type of track it is, it can go to a MIDI channel or it can go to transpose other tracks. So activating transpose will make sure that it follows those master transpose tracks. And then finally, activating pattern, the pattern setting for a track, will activate the world of patterns for that particular track. So what does patterns mean? Remember, we have 64 tracks, which we can mute or unmute, and then we can chain them up in sequences where they're muted or not muted per sequence. But each of the 64 tracks can also store 32 patterns per track. So I prepared an example of this in my Digitact track. You can see that patterns are enabled. Now, to access the 32 patterns that are stored in this track, you need to press both step and track together. And you can see that the top portion of the screen has now changed to this view, to pattern view. And you can tell both by the brightly lit pad as well as the two lines above the pattern that pattern number 2 is the active pattern for this track, for the Digitact track. So let's listen to this. And now I can move to, let's say, this pattern. Right? Or move to this one. Right, so these are different drum patterns in the one Digitact track. Here's a nice little shortcut. Regardless of where you're at, hold the step button and you can change patterns. And if you look on screen, there's also a little P1, P2, P3 to designate the pattern number. Now, patterns obviously do add another layer of complexity to tracks and to creating songs within Pyramid. If you're uncomfortable with that, you can just create individual tracks with, say, different track patterns or different synth patterns and so on, and then mute or unmute those tracks as you want. But I think that using patterns makes much more sense because then you have a track per instrument and the different parts or things that it plays per pattern. So basically it's up to you to choose which workflow you're more comfortable with, muting or unmuting tracks or moving amongst different patterns in one track, and you can obviously do a combination of both. Both workflows are sequenceable in sequence mode, which I promise we'll get to. Okay, so those are patterns within a track. Now let's talk about time signatures. Overall, Pyramid has two modes, two polyrhythm or polymeter modes, or two ways to treat tracks with different time signatures. You need to make this decision in the settings, which you reach like this, as you remember, and go into time signature and choose either polyrhythms or polymeters. This decision is made on a per project basis. I recommend sticking to polyrhythms because you can accomplish polymeters in polyrhythm mode, but not vice versa. So let's go back to our track. To keep it simple, I'll mute these and go to track 4. Call up my Digitact settings. And let's just sequence this. And then go in here, copy this track, and then paste it here. And then in this track, let's do something else. So if I add these steps, right, perfectly aligned for 4 tracks. But if I change the time signature for this track to, let's say, 3/4, it's still going to sound the same because it did its best to realign the tracks. But really what's going on here is we have 12 steps in this bar. And if I add these here, notice that it's triplets. So this is moving forward at one rate, and then this track is moving forward at a different rate. And that's basically the essence of polyrhythms. A bar takes the same amount of time whether it's split into 4 notes or into 3 notes. In changing the time signature, you can change the number on top by rotating the data knob, and the number on the bottom by holding it in and rotating it. So those are polyrhythms. What are polymeters? With polymeters, each beat takes the same amount of time. So a 12-beat bar will just end quicker than a 16-beat bar. Now you can get an effect similar to polymeters within polyrhythm mode by changing the track length, but rather than changing it by single bar steps, you can hold down the encoder and change it by fractional bars. Which can lead to very interesting polymetric patterns within polyrhythm mode. And we can get a good idea at how these tracks are making progress in relation to each other using the display button in track mode. Alright, so now that we understand track mode, we know that we can mute and unmute tracks, and we know that we can select patterns from within an active track. Let's take a look at sequence mode. Pyramid can store 32 sequences in 2 banks. You've got bank number 1 with sequences 1 to 16, and then bank number 2, 17 to 32. A sequence is basically a way to store the mute states and the pattern selections for each of the tracks. This might be clearer if I hit the display button. You can see that I have 3 sequences here. In sequence number 1, Digitact pattern 2 is active, and the DSI Rev 2 pattern 1 is active. And you can see track 1 is muted throughout all patterns, by the way. And then sequence number 2, I'm using pattern 3 of the Digitact track and still pattern 1 of the Rev 2. And then with sequence number 3, pattern 1 of the Digitact is active, and again pattern 1 of the Rev 2. If I go ahead and mute track 3, you can see that it's muted in sequence 3 as well. Pretty simple, right? Now there are 3 ways to move about sequences. One way is just to perform them live. So this is one sequence, this is another, sequence 2, sequence 3, and then this one bar here determines how quickly it moves from one sequence to the other. You can take a few bars or just move on the beat, right? Not wait. And that's how you perform with sequences live. The 2 other options are to set up a chain of sequences and then either play them once or loop them. The chain of sequences is written down here, and to create a sequence, I just move the cursor down, press down, select a sequence number. Once I select the sequence number, it'll tell me how long a full sequence is, which is how long it takes for the tracks to repeat themselves fully, and then I can choose how long I want the sequence to be. So typically I would choose 2 because the full sequence is 2 bars. And then I can go ahead and add sequence number 2 and then sequence number 3. And if I move to either play or loop mode, let's choose play, my sequence will play. All right, now it's going to move to sequence 2. Then move on to sequence 3. And then since it's on play, it's just going to stop. Loop will just make it go on forever. You can see this little bar here tells us how the sequence is progressing. With polyrhythmic chains, this could take a while. And indeed, if I say go into this track and set an odd length just to mess around with the system, let's say this. If I now go ahead and add a sequence, let's say 1, you can see that it will take a full 9 bars to repeat. Let me just undo the damage here. Okay, we're back to normal, 2 bars. Now, sequence mode also has a temporary latch if you want, so if you're in step mode and want to temporarily change a sequence, you just hold it down, pick the sequence you want, and move to that one. Another nice sequencing function, when a sequence is playing, you can always hit second and use the arrow keys to immediately move from one sequence to the other. So that's sequence mode, relatively simple. Remember, we can go into the track parameters to choose how a track will behave once a sequence changes, whether it just continues to run, goes back to the beginning and runs once, or goes back to the beginning and continues to run in loop. And copy, paste, and delete works with sequences as well. Finally, sequence has its own display mode as well. It'll tell you what's going on here in terms of which tracks and patterns are active, which sequence is coming up next, and which tracks are active, have content, and the sequence length as well. That's pretty much it for sequence mode. So we covered live mode, step mode, track mode, pattern mode, which is both of these together, and sequence mode. Let's talk about the MIDI effects section. MIDI effects is one of Pyramid's standout features. Just like audio effects manipulate audio, MIDI effects modify note data. Each track has 5 MIDI effects slot. The first one is always the quantize effect, and it's off by default, so notes aren't quantized. You can tell that it's off, by the way, because it's grayed out over here. And the other 4 can be anything you want. I've got the arpeggiator in here. I can go ahead and add another MIDI effect if I wanted to, let's say a harmonizer, and it will take its place to the right of the arpeggiator. Now, the order of the effects matters. A harmonizer after the arpeggiator isn't like a harmonizer before an arpeggiator. Let me explain. So if I have an arpeggiator going here and it's just arpeggiating these 2 notes, right? And then I go ahead and modify the harmonizer effect. Then the MIDI effect chain will first take these 2 notes and split them up, and then harmonize each of those notes. If I were to take this effect in the chain and move it before the arpeggiator, and you can do that by holding second and turning the data knob, we would get a completely different result. Right? Compare this to this. So MIDI notes come in through here, and then each effect handles them in turn. Editing an effect is easy, or replacing one. You just click the effect, and then you can either edit, delete, or just choose a different one as you like. You edit the effect parameters using the encoders. So I can add more harmonies. Chaining effects can yield some pretty interesting results. How cool is this? You can also jump to a specific effect by just clicking the knob that represents it. 5 knobs, 5 effects. There are 12 different MIDI effects overall. I won't go over all their parameters, but let's sort of just take a look or a sampler at the highlights. The quantizer effect lets you snap notes to a grid, and you can choose what that grid looks like. And then with human plus and human minus, you can unsnap those notes. And legato is a feature with synths that support it. It just makes the notes a little bit longer so that the transitions from one note, typically in a mono synth, to another will be smooth. I will turn off the harmonizer just so we can appreciate the arpeggiator. There are quite a few arpeggiator styles. Let's add some octaves. This has all the standard modes you'd expect in an arpeggiator, and also some very interesting ones I've never seen before. cool stuff. We already saw what the harmonizer can do. Let's add another one. Let's take a look at swing. Swing gives you the usual features you'd expect to see in swing, plus quite a few more options. Like the ability to change the quantization grid and accent either the swung or the first note. So that's pretty interesting. Let's change this to the randomizer. Let's check that out. That will take incoming notes and either randomize their velocity, pitch, octave, or length. Octave, note length. Let's stick around with pitch for a second. Now this sounds pretty crazy, but it might make more sense if we add a scale MIDI effect to it. You can choose the scale and the key, and whether notes that aren't in the scale and key will be filtered or not. And maybe if we have notes that are slightly less random, it might start to make sense. Right? So that's how the effects work with each other really nicely. Let me clear out this mess so that we can check out some other effects. The delay effect is a nice way to have an effect like delay, only with MIDI. Nice. Let's bring back my arpeggiator. The chance effect lets you randomize not your pitch, but rather whether notes happen at all. The chance factor determines the probability that a note plays or not. It's like a probability filter, basically. And there are a few others you can get creative with. For example, the CC MIDI effect will take a note and convert it to a CC parameter. And there are a broad range of cases where this can be useful, for example with devices like the Volca sample that for some odd reason expect to receive pitch as a CC message. Another interesting effect is the equalizer effect. This is literally like EQ for MIDI, so if your synth is too loud on the lows or on the highs, you can adjust its velocity based on the note. And then finally, there is the LFO MIDI effect, which is a really nice one because it lets you take any CC parameter, send it out to your synth, but have that be modulated just like an LFO. Let's check this out in action. I'll turn it on and choose, let's say, a sine wave. This works only when the pattern is active, but you can see how the graph changes. It's a triangle. Now you can send this data to any CC parameter over MIDI, as well as to pitch, pressure, and program change. So those were the MIDI effects, and remember all the MIDI effects, including BPM, which controls the project tempo and I didn't cover, are modulatable destinations within Pyramid. Now up until now we've been using these knobs to change parameters and this to draw automation, but you can actually assign each and every one of these knobs and the XY pad to any MIDI CC parameter you like. To do that, you hold assign and then turn the knob, and you can choose any number of destinations. MIDI CC is just one of them. And all the parameters are accessible here. Additional destinations are effect parameters. We discussed this before in the automation. You choose the track, and then you choose the effect that you want to change. And it's really nice that when you move the knob, you see a nice big display of what you're changing. If you want to control all the MIDI effects rather than just one track, just choose Effect Master, and then you choose the parameter you want to change, let's say quantization in this case, and it will apply across the tracks. You can also use Assign with the XY pad, and aside from the CC and effect parameters, there are a bunch of neat things you can do like play different notes if you like. And you can also assign the CV inputs. Just hold the assign button, plug in a cable, and then choose the destination. Finally, if you have a knobby external MIDI controller, you can also hold assign, turn one of its knobs, and then assign that external knob to a destination that you want. Let's talk a bit about project management. Everything I talked about up until now, the 64 tracks, the 32 sequences, 32 patterns per track, all of that is one project. They don't take much space, so you can practically store as many of these as you want on the SD card. You access the save and load functions by hitting second and this button. You can create new tracks, save as, rename them, or load one of the existing ones. A nice little added bonus is that Pyramid stores its sequences as regular plain old MIDI files. So you can import your own MIDI files from your DAW or download ones off the web and play entire MIDI sequences as if they were any other track in your project. You can scroll around, edit the notes, just like any other track. As a matter of fact, if you import a MIDI file with multiple tracks, they'll be imported as patterns in your project. Finally, let's take a look at a few more settings that I think are interesting. Now, obviously, there are quite a few of these here and no time to cover them all. On the MIDI in menu, there are a lot of options. We won't cover them all. I think that MIDI Echo is an interesting one. The idea here is that if you have an external synth where you can't disconnect its keyboard from the synth itself, what's called local off, and you still want to use it as a keyboard to enter data into Pyramid, you can turn off MIDI Echo, and then notes that it plays won't be sent back to that synth. MIDI out gives you control over what data is sent out which output. The CV/pedal menu has options as you would expect for CV and gate, as well as, I think the interesting thing here is what you assign to the envelope out, and you can choose a bunch of things to go out that voltage output. The miscellaneous, again, a lot more than what we have time to cover. Live looping we talked about before, that lets you set track length dynamically. Signature we talked about as well. I think that one of the interesting things here is the auto pattern option. The idea here is that you can have the patterns on the tracks follow the numbers of the sequences. So rather than having to manually assign pattern 1 to sequence 1, pattern 2 to sequence 2, pattern 3 to sequence 3, this takes care of it for you. Now, there are many more settings here. Check them out. One of them may support a workflow you're interested in. Next up, the info screen is actually pretty useful to monitor incoming voltage on the analog inputs, as well as MIDI notes. You'll see them appear here. And then save lets you save the MIDI settings in case you want to retain them when you turn off your machine. So that is pretty much it for Pyramid by Squarp. If you like this video, please hit like. If you have any questions or comments, write them in the comments section below. Click subscribe and ring the little bell if you want to see more. Thanks for watching.